Let me start by saying that I love the hell out of this game. There's a reason why for the longest time, and arguably still to this day, this is in the top, like, 3 or 4 of my favorite 4X strategy games ever. It's actually funny because, by all accounts, this game shouldn't have been made, or at least certainly not like this. You see, there was a lot of... Well, I've decided to skip through all the rigmarole of the specifics because all I'm going to say is that there was a lot of legal crap going on about the time after Civilization 2 came out, especially surrounding microprose and pretty much directly leading to the eventual shutdown and destruction of microprose. So there were some rights issues, and there were some management issues, and there were some financial issues, and copyright issues, and there were lawsuits being levied at the time. So several people, including Brian Reynolds, Sid Meier, and Jeff Briggs, decided, we just want to make games. Can we go do that? So they went off and founded a company called Firaxis, which is actually still around to this day, and is still producing games to this day. In fact, Civ 6 just had an expansion come out relatively recently under the Firaxis label. So they were like, all right, what do we want to make? Well, first we want to make this game called Gettysburg, which I'm not talking about today. But in the background, for about 3 years, actually that's not accurate, for about 1.5 years, in the background they were working on this game, and then for the other 1.5 years they started actually focusing on this game. Because everyone involved pretty much wanted to make another 4X game, but they wanted to make like the next step, right? I mean, Civilization 2 was great and all, but how can we do more of that? And that leads us to this game right here. The simplest way to explain this game back in the day would be, imagine Civ 2 but better in every way, and there you go, there's Alpha Centauri. I mean, honestly, there's only so much you can say about it, unless you get into the nitty-gritty, which of course I'm going to try to do at least a little bit. First of all, the AI was probably the best AI when it comes to the enemy factions that had been seen to this point in time. One of the biggest consequences and flaws of, well, every strategy game ever, especially in the 4X genre, though, is making the AI and actually work. And it's not just about making them better at crushing you or defeating you. It's more like making them, well, better at diplomacy is probably the way to put that. Because usually, even in more modern games, the enemy basically has one of two states. Hi, we're friends, or I'm going to kill you. And well, there's just not a lot of complexity to the diplomacy angle of things, and a lot of players, myself included, really wanted more complexity in that. And apparently so did the developers of this game, because they went out of their way to add a huge number of variables attached to all of the different things in this game. The type of economy you're using, the type of buildings you produce, the specific locations of your bases and relevance to theirs, the locations of your troops relevant to theirs, the actual specific character you are, which I'll talk about later, in relation to theirs. Also, all of these things were all tracked, and each of these would add to a plus or a negative modifier. Now, it still boils down to, we like you, we hate you, because it's still basically a binary bar. But at the very least, there was enough complexity in why they liked you or hated you that it felt closer to actual diplomacy. And that was one of the big appeals of this game for me and several of my friends, especially playing co-op in this game, since, especially when you crank everything up to max, well, this can be a pretty rough game. I also liked how the terrain was a full 3D mesh rather than the typical grid, and not just because of graphics. In fact, actually, I would say primarily not because of graphics, but instead because the terrain actually really, really matters. I mean, terrain has always mattered in any strategy game whatsoever, at least a good one. But what I mean by that is, it matters what's on the tile, you know, what type of stuff is on the tile, that's your usual modifiers. It matters, and then it matters its elevation, because it's a 3D mesh. And that elevation also matters relevant to nearby elevations. In fact, well, I'm going to go off topic a little bit here, but one of the things I liked most about this game is that it allowed you to make custom factions. It was actually really easy, relatively speaking, to go in, because the game was so modular by design, designed in the similar veins to Civilization 2, which is also an incredibly modular game. So I went in and designed a few of my own custom factions, including a group I called the Terraformers, whose big things were just terraforming. They had really good terraforming tech. They started out with terraforming tech, they started out with a terraformer, etc., etc. And I would go terraform my way to victory, because you can do that. Now, there's obviously consequences for doing that, and it's still kind of hard to approach from a military angle, but there's something really satisfying about basically removing the land connection between you and an enemy by sinking it beneath the ocean, so they literally can't reach you unless they get a naval power going. Like, it was just awesome that that was a choice. Alpha Centauri also, of course, supported going wide as well as going tall. Now, most strategy games, most 4X games in particular, support going wide. That's pretty much normal. Very few of them really supported going tall. There's a reason why the single city challenge is usually considered a challenge, is because most strategy games don't really go in that direction. But in this one, thanks to the enormous amount of benefit you can get in a singular city or a small group of cities, and the amount of terraforming that you can do, which I just emphasized, meant that you could actually make a small empire that was still at the rival level of some of the larger empires. Which brings me to, well, one of the next things that I think is one of the best aspects of the game. The faction you pick matters. Now, I'll talk about the story side of that in a little bit, but I'm talking specifically from a gameplay perspective. Each faction, like if you choose to play as Russia or the United States in Civ 2, it didn't really matter all that much. Here, it is a fundamental change to your playstyle. In fact, there's certain victories or certain types of tech or certain types of social structure that you literally cannot do, that you're just locked out from depending on your faction choice. In other words, you're supposed to pick a faction that fits your playstyle, or that you want to try the playstyle of. So again, faction really, really matters. If you're paying attention, this is something that they took forward when it came to several of their future developments in the Civilization series, which I think was a good thing, personally. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like having a cosmetic faction too, but I also want to play a faction that I want to play, you know? There's a reason why I main Egypt or Russia when it comes to Civ 5, for example, because I like those playstyles. So that was awesome. And I've jotted down all the factions here. We'll talk about those in just a second. There is a bit of a catch here, because, and this is kind of tying into a game I'll be looking at before or after this. I actually don't remember. I don't have my calendar in front of me here. But either way, Star Wars Rebellion, because the factions, I mean, I guess true faction balance is obviously impossible. But for the most part, there are some factions which are just better than the other factions, especially when controlled by the AI. The big ones being the University of Planet, the Cybernetic Consciousness, and both of the Manifolds. Now, the thing is, the University of Planet, they're the tech faction. Again, I'll talk more about the factions in specific. But that means they are in an extremely good position, based on their unique advantages, to be able to lunge forward research-wise to a point that no one else can ever really catch up on. And if you are at the point where you're fielding actual mechas or tanks or helicopters when everyone else is running around with rovers, you can see the problem. There's also the Cybernetic Consciousness, which basically has the exact same advantage, just kind of multiplied more, and I'll talk more about that in a second. The Manifolds are interesting. So both Manifold races are the alien races, which, again, we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But both Manifolds have significant and supreme advantages to them, and really only two disadvantages. They don't show up at the beginning of the game, they don't show up for 10 in-game years, and they can't really diplomatize with the humans. That's it. Those are the only disadvantages. So in general, well, I will say this, I tend to play without the alien races on at all, because the only reason to play with them is if you want a universally hostile faction that you want to try to overcome, which is a valid thing and totally true. But if I don't feel like having one enemy at all times to deal with, I usually just turn them off. Now, there's a lot of other things that this game does right, and it's hard to really discuss without just showing you the game. And obviously I can't show game footage for the reasons we've discussed many times. So rather than go into that, I'm just going to say that I love the complexity of this game even to this day. Although it is still kind of hard to play. In fact, just getting this playable at all is kind of a little thing you have to do. I still enjoy playing it. Like, other than the problems with playing it in windowed mode and actually getting it running, the game itself has aged quite well, in my opinion. There are a couple of issues, notably the animations just are a little bit stilted and tend to take a little bit too long to happen. Like, there's this weird thing where it'll go, turn, animation, 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 turn. You know, it drags it out a little bit, but those are really minor issues. So I actually highly recommend you play this game if you would want to. It's on Good Old Games right now, so you can just go pick it up. And it comes with the expansion. And before I move into the story stuff, I want to talk about the expansion, because in general, when it comes to strategy games, I tend to prefer playing it with the expansion on. Civ 5 is a wonderful example of that. Without both expansions, in my opinion, Civ 5 isn't that great. with both expansions. Civ 5 is my favorite, well, among my favorite 4X games of all time. So you can kind of see the difference there. Alien Crossfire is kind of a weird one for me because I don't actually like Alien Crossfire that much. It added a few new techs and a few new buildings, which is, okay, sure. It added a bunch of new races, but it didn't really support a larger map size, by which I mean you're still capped at how many players can be active on the map at a time, which means that you can't actually have a map with all the new races, or all the new factions, I should say. So you can just have pick and choose, or randomize, or however you want to play that. And that's the first flaw right there for me. The second flaw is most of the new factions just aren't all that interesting to me. One of them is very interesting, the Nautilus Pirates. That's great, and I'll talk more about them in a minute when we get to that, but for the most part, I just look at them like, okay. And like I said, the inclusion of the aliens didn't do anything for me. I already admit I don't like the high sci-fi aspects of this game. And I know what you're thinking. What the hell are you talking about, Lore? This game is actually a very hard science game. Like, the overall lore and presentation of things are extremely hard science, with only a couple of notable exceptions, mostly everything about the mindworms and the planet. And then there's the transcendence thing, and then there's the aliens thing, which is related to the transcendence thing. And it's just, I don't know, I don't care for that. It's just not my thing. It's coffee. So the inclusion of more transcendent stuff in the form of the manifolds people just makes me go, okay. I also have to admit that story-wise, there's nothing interesting about them for me, which we're kind of getting to that. I swear I'll talk about that in a minute. So, admittedly, back in the day when I used to play this, I usually used to play with either the Crossfire off, or I would just have none of the new factions involved, except maybe the Pirates. Let's talk about those factions really quick, because, well, see, another problem is that each of the expansion factions are overpowered in their own way. Each of the base factions was very carefully crafted and designed to, like I said, encourage a particular playstyle value. But there's... hang on, I wrote them down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's what I thought. There's 7 of them. It's hard to get more than 7 playstyles in a 4X game that came out in the late 90s. Hell, that would be hard to pull off now. So... and it's worth noting that the additional increase of complexity, the addition of drones, talents... the existence of hacking, the nature of how research development works, the nature of how unit development works. One of the things I like most about this game is rather than building a Steel Iron Legion character like you would in Civ 2, you instead have you can customize what you build. So you start off with like a base unit of your transportation, and then you graft modules onto it based on what you've researched. That's awesome. And in fact, if you're paying attention, a lot of more modern 4X and grand strategy games have a similar concept where you can design what it is you're building. Galactic Civilizations, Stellaris does that. I can't think. Endless Space 2 does that. A lot of space games now that I'm thinking about it. So I like that concept. I do. But there's no but. There's no but. That's a good thing. I have no but. Instead, what we have, these additional layers of complexity to the formula are what allow these playstyle things to exist. Like, how could you possibly have something like, for example, Sister Marian Godwinson in Civ 2? I mean, you could kind of pull that off. Or how about Colonel Santiago is another example. Or the Gaia's Stepdaughters is probably the penultimate example from the original 7. You simply couldn't have something like the Stepdaughters back in Civ 2. Now, that being stated, let's go through the expansion, guys. So there's the Nautilus Pirates. Now, they're my favorite faction because they're the ones who really do change up the dynamic. They're water-bound. They actually can build bases and cities, basically, on the ocean. That's great. It also means that they have a unique set of resources and priorities when it comes to settlements, which is also great. It also means that they can effectively strangle the oceans of planet, which means that they can effectively landlock anyone else and prevent them from expanding or doing anything thanks to aggressive maneuvers or outright war. So you can see how that can be kind of overpowered. But I do enjoy playing as them, not because of the overpoweredness, but just because of the naval thing. In fact, I actually made a custom race, which was a little less strong, but still had the naval capacity thing, just to keep playing as that concept, because I loved it so much. Then we have the Cult of Planet. The Cult of Planet is the Gaia's Stepdaughters, but more so. And they suck. I mean, they're not bad. In fact, again, they are overpowered. They are arguably a stronger version of the Stepdaughters. But the problem is, anytime there's two factions, not counting the aliens, that if you encounter in a map, you know that that's going to end in war, and you know you're going to have to deal with them. And the Cult of Planet is one of those, because their actual ideological thing, I suppose I should mention, the ideological thing for the Nautilus Pirates is we're not actually a faction. Like, in lore, the Nautilus Pirates are not a nation. It's just a group of people who happen to coordinate with each other. They're just pirates. You know, Pirates of the Caribbean pirates. They raid, they loot, they pillage, the end. The Cult of Planet, their ideology is humanity was a mistake. So we have two options, okay? We can ascend and transcend and become one with planet, thereby fixing the mistake, or we can fail at that, which means we should all die. In other words, in lore, this is not a joke, in any victory that is not Transcendence victory, the Cult of Planet would commit mass suicide. Then we have the Cybernetic Consciousness. Now, the Cybernetic Consciousness... Oh, I suppose, as I was mentioned, the Cult of Planet, like I said, their advantages all have to do with planet itself. Better terraforming, better use of mind worms, that kind of a thing. The Cybernetic Consciousness is, again, the tech people plus one. They have extremely high advanced technology, and at very few real disadvantages, and the fact that they can just skyrocket their tech super quickly means if you want to play easy mode, they're probably the best faction to pick. Which leads me to the Data Angels. Now, the Data Angels are weird because the whole hacking thing is more of a sub-mechanic than a full mechanic in its own right. Which means, as a consequence, that the Data Angels, who are the hacker faction, aren't actually that great unless they happen to parasitically attach themselves to one of the tech factions, most notably the University of Planet, who is actually vulnerable to hacking. In those circumstances, the Data Angels are great, and basically just get better and better by leeching off tech and resources off of other people until they can just run over everything. In many ways, the Data Angels actually are a continuation of the economic playstyle of the Morganites, but we'll move on for now. And then there's the free drones. The free drones are interesting in their own right, and probably I'd say the second most interesting race of the new races for me. I keep saying race, the new factions for me. Because the drones are people who are all about the people, right? So that means they're probably the most unique, because obviously they have benefits that involve worker happiness and production value. But the thing that really makes them interesting is anytime another faction's city goes into revolt and it's not dealt with, that city flips sides to the drones to join the workers' paradise. Now, if you're paying attention, you're like, hang on, lore, a lot of this sounds like there's some lore to these factions, to which you're absolutely right. Alpha Centauri isn't completely unique because it's been like almost 19 years since this game came out. Actually, I guess it's been 20 years now, hasn't it? Good lord. It's been a long time since this game came out. But the really interesting thing here is this game does have a story. And I don't just mean your Russia. I mean, there is a cohesive storyline leading up to and then following through the events of the game. This storyline is something you could completely ignore if you want to, or you can get completely immersed in if you want to. The story is told in quotes and interactions when you build bases, when you research tech, and when you complete projects. All three of these things give you a little quote and usually a little visual blurb, and that kind of helps develop the story and the presentation of what's going on. Because there is a lore to this game. These are characters, the ones I've been discussing here, are actual people with personalities and ideologies. Which brings me to the first and most interesting thing about this is that this is an ideological game rather than a national game. What I mean by that is, in most fiction, and in real life, most people make up dividing lines based on, I don't want to say arbitrary, more, let's call it fundamental values, right? Well, you have the same skin color as me. We are brothers. Well, you have a different skin color as me. We're enemies. We're born in the same location. We're brothers. You know, birth, gender, and race, creed, that kind of stuff tends to be the sort of thing that tends to divide lines for admittedly obvious reasons. But here, it has absolutely nothing to do with that. Your race, your gender, and all of that is absolutely irrelevant. All that matters is your ideology. So, let's cover the story a little bit here to kind of explain why this is an ideological faction thing rather than anything else. All the way back in the day, there was this planet called Earth, and it was going to hell. like mass, near constant warfare, mass economic destruction, mass environmental destruction. Earth is screwed, right? And by all accounts, Earth, by the time this game really gets started, is actually extinct. As a final project, the dying UN decided to go ahead and launch a ship which is called the Unity, which is going to contain some of the best and brightest humanity to leave. Anybody who has played Xenoblade Chronicles X is probably familiar with this general concept. As a quiet aside, I've always wondered if Xenoblade Chronicles X had any ideas drawn from Alpha Centauri. But anyways, so a whole bunch of people got involved and got on board. All of the faction leaders, with 3 exceptions, which include the 2 aliens and the kid from the Cult of Planet, are all from that. They're all people who joined on board the Unity to deal with the situation. Naturally, because this is life, everything went wrong. So the Unity was launched under Captain Garland, who for some reason is immortal because he keeps going back in time 2,000 years, had to try and deal with a crisis when a lot of the cryosleep things made people wake up early. Now, there's actually a short story leading up to this game, which I highly recommend you read if you haven't, by the way, especially if you're interested in the game, that kind of details some of the events of the last few hours/days of the Unity. But the long and the short of it is, people were screwed, and it was entirely possible and within the realm of reason that, given the circumstances, humanity was going to die right here and right now. Because almost the moment that everyone woke up and started eating through their supplies, which they were supposed to have on planet, by the way, I refer to it as planet, capital P, because that's what it's called. It's technically Chiron, but, you know, it's planet. Anyways, people started forming groups almost immediately, as would be the norm for human social things. That's how people are. Line mentality exists for a reason. But most of these people had been thrown together into this project to work together, and now they're in a crisis, so they started forming on ideological lines rather than, well, you happen to look similar to me or whatever. Now, that being stated, it's probably worth noting that the Unity project did have a couple of interesting side things going into it. See, there's 2 names I want to mention in particular, because most of the people got on board by virtue of their skill or their talent. 2 people got on board and probably shouldn't have. Those are Nwabudike Morgan of the Morganites and Yang, Chairman Zhengji Yang. And by the way, I'm going to struggle with these pronunciations. I've listened to these names so many times, and they say them so fluently. One of the things I love about this game is they actually went out of the way in almost every case to get a voice actor from the region that the character is supposed to be in to voice the lines. So we actually have natural Russian, natural Chinese, natural African, etc. accents for things. It's good stuff. I am not natural any of these things. I am an idiot American, so I'm just struggling with pronunciation, so please forgive me. Now, Nwabudike, he was the interesting one because he basically said, have my money. And when it came to the development of the Unity, again, parallels to XBX or XBCX, as I mentioned earlier. So he basically bought a ticket. He bought a seat on the Unity, and that was his only requirement. By all accounts, he actually was basically funding as much money as other nations were in order to get the Unity developed. So he is probably one of the biggest reasons why humanity survived at all. So I'm not really against him being on board, because unlike your typical corporate mogul, he's not an idiot. He is, in fact, very intelligent, which makes him extremely dangerous. In fact, in lore, I would say that Morgan is probably one of the deadliest people of the new factions, and one of the most dangerous factions of them. Now, that doesn't usually follow that way in terms of gameplay, but yeah. Yang, on the other hand, he actually lied and manipulated his way through the tests to get on board because he shouldn't have, because he's a sociopath. I don't mean that as an insult, I mean that as a statement of fact. Zhengji Yang is probably insane and actually has psychological programming built into some of the people. One of the most infamous examples is that when the Spartan guard gets to him and she has specific orders not to let him talk, he is allowed to talk and then convinces her to shoot herself and then gets free and then starts doing his own thing. And then the Spartans start torturing him and he's just like, yeah, whatever. Yeah, he's the closest thing to an overarching villain that this game has, unless you count the manifolds, which, or planet itself, which is a matter of perspective. So having done all this, the people started factionalizing, and everything just kind of got even more and more out of control very quickly, and more groups started separating based on party lines, effectively. Deciding that, well, to use one example, Miss Deidre Sky was saying, well, hang on, we can't seed the planet with all these resource pods. That's polluting. Now, I hope you're paying attention to that, because that's kind of an extremist statement. It's because it's not polluting, or at least it's not deliberate polluting. It's more like we need to have access to resources when we get planet-side, and we're trying to get them from the ship to the planet, so we're going to launch them down at the planet. You know, we're not trying to say, who cares about all that toxic waste? And yet she was still very upset about this idea. I think this all makes this whole game far more interesting, because what we see in all of the factions is very similar to BioShock in its own way, is they're all extremists, all of them. Now, most of them have a sort of hypocrisy to them, a part of them that the individual leaders don't really align with the ideology of their faction. But having said that, it makes so much sense why they're all so extremist to me, personally. Because Earth was a wreck, right? So that means two things. Number one, most people back on Earth were probably extremists to some extent or another, which was leading to Earth becoming a wreck. So in other words, just about everyone who leaves is going to be a wreck, or is going to be an extremist to some extent or another. And number two, remember, Earth is basically extinct that we just left behind, and everyone knows it. Nobody wants to repeat that. And everyone has their own idea how to do it. And they think about it, and they think about all the problems they saw on the planet. It's like, okay, this makes perfect sense. We just need to make sure we don't do those things wrong anymore. And so everyone kind of picks something to focus on to prevent those wrongs. And that makes perfect sense, because you're right. Right? You know you're right. You know how to fix all these problems. So every single one of them is completely self-convinced that they know how to make sure that planet doesn't have all the issues that Earth did. So we see this factionalizing getting worse and worse and more and more out of cycle until Garland is assassinated. Funny story, even though there's been multiple books written for this game, which by itself says something for its story content, we never learned who assassinated Garland. Anywho, Garland is assassinated, and that's basically the end right there. He was the only one who had the charisma, the intellect, and the will to try and keep everyone together. Because remember, this was supposed to be a joint operation. Instead, everyone factionalized hard with his death. And then, as basically a final act, all of the pods were sent down to the surface, leading to each of the factions ending up in different parts of the planet and having to make a go of it with their own particular ideology. Now, before I actually move forward in talking about each of these guys, I want to talk about three other concepts, and then I'll talk about the 7 factions, and then we'll basically be done. First of all, this game is absolutely damned horrifying. Like, whoa, kind of horrifying. You know, Keanu Reeves is looking at this like, I don't even know what to say to that. Because, and it's the best kind of horror. It's the kind of thing that's completely normal until you think about it. Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb. Just to name one example, some of you know what I'm referencing there. And this game is utterly unabashed in showing just how harsh and brutal this environment is. There's so many horrible things, but I just got to say 2 things really struck out for me personally. One is the cubing thing. Now, this is something the aliens do. They utilize human corpses as a resource, which means they'll shove humans into these cube things. So you see they kind of cube corpses. So I want you to imagine mashing in, just kind of... The second thing is the punishment spheres. Punishment spheres are a natural outcropping of nerve stapling. The mere fact that it's called nerve stapling should say everything that needs to, but the more we learn about nerve stapling, the more messed up it is. But punishment spheres is people who are nerve stapled basically in public. Like, I want you to picture you're pushed into a sphere, and then you're clamped in, and it's clear. It's see-through, and there's basically holes so people can hear you. People can hear you. People can see you, and then they activate the punishment sphere. I don't know what else to add to that. Now, nerve stapling, so the way nerve stapling works in specific is it will send extreme levels of stimulus to the point that actually can cause nerve damage, given the severity of the chemicals being transmitted, in extreme, at whatever it needs to do, which can lead to severe psychological programming, because if you're told, raise your right hand, and if you don't, you feel the worst pain that is possible to feel, you will probably learn to raise your hand when told to very quickly. It's something you can do that's actually considered an atrocity in the diplomacy of the game, that you have to go through hoops in order to make not an atrocity. And it also has very serious negative consequences. But it does get rid of people who are revolting in your city, because they physically can't anymore. There's a book. There's a book in the game that's referenced, I should say. How to raise a nerve-stapled child. So many things about that are wrong. Why would you ever nerve staple a child? Why would it be so commonplace as to have that need? Anyways. So a punishment sphere is kind of like that, but rather than doing that like just in order to program you, because remember, it doesn't have to be extreme pain. It can be extreme whatever. A punishment sphere just does pain, and very, very rapidly. So rather than just, okay, you're going to raise your hand, okay, and then sending, pleasure signals, it's just pain, 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 until whatever is left of you, mentally speaking, is goop. This is a really messed up game. I'm not even mentioning the more subtle things like the cloning facility. That one just always gets to me. Or the recycling vats. Anyways, so it's a very, very horrifying, very dark game. No wonder I like it, right? But the next thing I want to talk about, kind of related to that, is the aliens. So the alien factions, I have the least to say about them, but I wanted to mention them in their own right, because they are the implication of basically, let's call it another plot thread. So, spoiler alert, Planet is alive, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But the relevance of Planet being alive is it growing to full sentience and sapience involves a process called flowering. It happens once, roughly every 100 million years, which makes sense given the process that's happening on a planetary scale. The aliens, the manifolds, they refer to this as Manifold 6. So obviously there are other planets that have this, and they refer to flowering as a process that is actually being deliberately pursued. Based on evidence, when I was a kid, I was in college at this point. Wait, no, I wasn't. I was leaving high school. Sorry, so I wasn't actually in college yet. Based on the when I was first playing this, my first thought was, huh. So I guess these are the ones that built the planet. Well, no. Actually, the manifold species, by all accounts, they instead find these planets, which means this whole planetary consciousness thing is implied to be a natural development of just reality. Because this is not the first planet that they've encountered with that. The Tau Ceti planet is actually referenced several times, for example. Now, some of these manifold races, who are a spacefaring race, have decided to go ahead and artificially induce these flowerings in order to achieve godhood. You probably already see why this is starting to lose me in terms of the story. Because, for a fairly hard science, very down-to-earth, survival of the species, ideological thing, all of this I'm in favor of, and then there's the whole, oh, by the way, planetary consciousness, space aliens, and godhood thing. And when I say godhood, I mean that almost literally, because the intended purpose, and indeed the final step of the Transcendence Project, is to effectively become the overmind of consciousness, which can travel the stars without ships and fix Earth. That's one of the things you do. You go fix Earth. And what I find hysterical is that the game treats the Transcendence ending as not only canon, since most of the storytelling goes in that direction, but the good ending. Like, that's a good thing. I know. Ideology, and everyone's going to disagree based on what they believe and what they perceive. But for me, that's horrifying. That's almost as bad, not quite, but almost as bad as the green ending over in Mass Effect 3. As ever, I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are of the Transcendence ending, but I'm getting off topic. So the aliens, some of them are trying to artificially induce the Transcendence in order to become gods and rule on high as Sultan, or in their own tongue. Now, there's two alien factions. There's the usurpers. Those are the ones I just mentioned, the ones who want to cause a flowering, to, blah, blah, blah. And then there's the caretakers who are doing everything they can to prevent this from happening, because apparently something happened the last time they induced a flowering back in Tau Ceti. We don't know what. They never actually say in specific, but they mention that multiple nearby planets and systems suffered from whatever happened on Tau Ceti. So whatever happened was pretty large scale. So that's a thing. Both alien races cannot have peace with each other, and for the most part can't really negotiate or work with the humans. They are in almost every way a side story. In fact, in most cases they refer to humanity as basically dogs. As in, that's how much they think of them, not as the insult. If you landed on a new planet right now and you saw there was a whole civilization of dogs, that's about the relative equivalent. Now, it's worth noting that the story goes out of its way to prove them wrong almost constantly, that humans are more than capable of keeping up with them. It's just, in a multiplayer map, a human playing as an alien is going to probably win. So then, we have the third thing I want to talk about, and that's the longevity vaccine. This is one of my favorite personal things and inclusions of Alpha Centauri, and it's something that most other science fiction doesn't even touch. Or, not science fiction, lots of science fiction touches this, but most other 4X or long-term strategy games don't touch this. The idea is, how many of you played Crusader Kings 2? I know this is coming out of nowhere, but hear me out, okay? EU4 kind of does this too, but CK2 is really the better one, because in that you play a dude, and a billion things, slight exaggeration, can happen to kill you. If you do, you then go on to play your son, or your daughter, or whoever, and there's all sorts of ways to change who you play as next. But for the most part, you are still playing an individual throughout the playthrough of CK2. It's just you're playing multiple individuals, like a dynasty kind of situation, right? It's kind of the same here, except it's always an individual. This is the longevity vaccine. And if you play as the Morganites, you are Nwabudike Morgan the whole way through the game. And this is actually a part of the lore and part of the story. You actually have a sequence and a gene sequencing thing and stasis tech and all sorts of other devices, including the vaccine itself, which are developed to make you live forever, basically, or at least a few centuries or millennia or however long you choose to go. Now, this is unique because it kind of helped a lot of role players, and I know what you're thinking, oh, role players don't play 4X games, in which case, I don't know where you're from, but I've seen plenty of role players who like to role play in 4X games, but it also means you can always have a sort of a closer immersion connection point with your faction, because you are always Morgan, you are always Zakharov, you are always Godwinson, etc. And thus the ideological thing is carried forward, rather than just serving as a starting point. This also then helps to inform an in-lore reason for why they have such variances between playstyle. Because it's not like I start off with 3 extra minerals. It's more like, I start out being incapable of choosing a fundamentalist economic system or whatever. I know fundamentalism isn't an economic system, bear with me. So I just think that's a really cool addition to the series, and I wish more games would do something like that, especially these kind of long-term 4X games. Let's talk about the ideological thing, which I've been kind of building up towards, because I just want to cover the 7 in brief. First of all, I've mentioned him so many times, let's talk about Nwabudike Morgan. He's one of the more interesting things to me because, like I said, he is a corporate mogul who is smart rather than stupid. I mean, I could say so many actual real-life corporate people who are stupid rather than smart. But the point is, he is not just someone who is rich. He is someone who clawed his way up to riches. And that's a very key distinction. He believes very fundamentally in the very concept of economics. His opening quote is something along the lines of, human behavior is economic behavior. And I admit, being kind of an economics geek myself, I happen to really like playing as Morgan, but there's a lot of logic into what he says and how he says it. Now, he takes it a little bit too far because, I mean, screw reality and screw morals and ethics, am I right? But his playstyle is, as you're probably guessing, very economic playstyle. He generates far more credits than anyone else, which allows him to spend those credits on just about anything. Buying units, buying tech, buying off other factions. And because this makes so much sense, because it means basically Morgan's advantage in gameplay style is he can choose his advantage. Make sense? Because he can now say, I want to really make a lot of troops. I want to make a lot of advanced troops. I want to get along with each other diplomatically. Whatever advantage or playstyle I want to push for is all being funded by the currency, which actually does make sense, because currency, by definition, is a neutral good of universal value to serve as a modicum of trade. So in other words, if you had tons and tons of currency, You can fill in any deficit in your other in your weaknesses in your strategy because you have a universal. You get it? It actually makes a lot of sense. Now, I also have to say I love their usage of energy as currency. It's something that I love so much that after I played this game, I actually adjusted the Empire in my own setting to start using energy as currency because it just made so much sense. The idea is you have like a chip or whatever. I know this isn't a chip. And this chip contains, 1 or 3 or whatever jolts of energy, which can then be literally used because energy itself is a universal currency. It's something that in a science fiction setting and even in a modern setting is something that can be used for so many different purposes by just about everyone, right? Hence providing the default concept of what currency is. This is why so many things, historically speaking, that have been currency have been things that are universally useful. Make sense? So I love that, and it's a great addition to the thing. Also, I'm going to take a quick aside. Well, no, I'll save that for a minute. I'll save that for a minute. So the next one I talk about is the academician Prokofiev-Sakharov. Now, Prokofiev, oh God, stumbling over the name there. But he is the tech guy, University of Planet. Now, his advantage in his playstyle is very obvious. Lots and lots of research, lots and lots of research, lots and lots of, well, I think you get the point. Each one of these, his advantage is also kind of an exponential advantage. Anyone can go heavy on research, like Morgan I just mentioned. But Planet doesn't just gain research, they gain research which stacks on top of their research. They have an exponential growth of their research rate, which means if you want any kind of scientific victory or transcendence victory, Planet is actually, or University of Planet is probably one of the best and quickest ways to do that. It is probably the easiest I'd say the second easiest, actually, faction to play as if you're new. So if you want to go ahead and play as them, that's your shtick. But the easiest one, now that I just mentioned that, would be Commissioner Provenlal. I'm sorry, I didn't talk about Zakharov in general. There's not a lot to say about him. He is a fundamentalist scientist. Now, I want to explain what I mean by that. It might be more accurate to say he's a zealot scientist, because he treats science as his religion. In a zealous sort of a way. He is adamantly pro-science and adamantly anti-anything else. And to him, anything is really acceptable as long as it further develops things. This was one of the reasons why University of Planet is actually very easy to exploit all of its weaknesses for other players who know this, because research is really all they've got. All their other aspects of their society are very vulnerable. This is one of the reasons why the data angels can take such advantage of them. So Zakharov himself is someone who is also a source for almost every single aspect of the really creepy stuff I've talked about. A lot of his quotes are the kind of quote that's even more terrifying the more you think about it. Now, personality-wise, though, he is someone who believes, again, getting back to this, so I guess I should have mentioned this. Sorry, I actually didn't mention this back with Noah Boudica. Let's rewind back to Morgan for a second. Morgan believes, because I mentioned the ideology thing, he doesn't just believe in the economic system. He believes that all behavior is boiled down to a circumstance of economic flow-through, what we usually refer to as an economy, that this is literally the substance of civilization, life, and existence. And thus, this is one of the reasons why he pushes the economic model so hard, because he believes this is how life should be. He has this great quote about, we should take, screw the future. What untold right do they have to deny us resources? We should take, bite, and chew our fill. Basically, he kind of exonerates the benefits of greed without going to the point of being a Ferengi, because he actually has a brain, like I mentioned earlier. So that's his ideology. Switching back forward to Zakharov here. His ideology is that the big flaw of humanity back on Earth was that there was all this crap in the way of actually developing as a species. He firmly believes that we can develop as a species, that we can go forward, that we can develop more, that we can understand the fundamental building blocks of reality, and if we do so, we will be able to uplift ourselves and solve all of the problems we had back on Earth, if we just had the knowledge, if we just had the technology. And thus, being that the highest point of significance, all circumstances necessary to accomplish that are acceptable. In other words, he is not an evil scientist. He's not Mengele, right? Don't look that name up if you don't know what I'm talking about. He's not Mengele. But instead, he is someone who is more completely amoral. Someone who thinks that there's nothing wrong with, mass murdering people in order to advance science. He's also not someone who is against giving people money or benefits to advance science. In other words, it's not always like the worst possible way to develop, kind of like Vault Tech over in Fallout, but rather whatever is necessary to develop. I suppose that is then a good time to talk about Sister Marian Godwinson, who is the religious nut. Or I should say, the other religious nut. There's actually like 4 of them, but anyways. Now, her faction is actually one of the hardest to explain, because religion isn't actually a concept in this game. In fact, I'm pretty sure it would take, until Civ 4? Civ 4 or Civ 5, until religion became a mechanic in a civilization game, or a game of this type. But, which is several years after this, obviously. But in this game, the religious zealotry basically boils down to 2 things. If you try to take a, what are they called? I have to actually look it up. It's the Lord's Believers. If you try to like a Believers faction base, they're going to put up a hell of a fight because of their increased defenses. And they can support a far larger and more, basically their fanaticism to the cause allows them to support more than they otherwise would in terms of infrastructure and in terms of military. And they gain bonuses to attack because they are fervent believers in their cause. So if you want to play an aggressive militarist expansionist, here you go. Now, Miriam herself is interesting. She's actually a shrink. And she is apparently very adept at using her knowledge of psychology to completely manipulate other people into whatever she is going with. Now, that being said, she does legitimately believe in the cause. She is a true zealot. But that's almost worse than if she didn't and was just manipulating people towards that end, because she really does think that everything back on Earth was a spiritual problem. And it's hard not to see her point. And I'm saying this way, by the way. I'm not pro-religion or anti-religion, and I don't like to talk about that topic on my show. But I want to say this because so many people look at her as if she's the bad guy, mostly because of how her AI is built to be hyper-aggressive, so anytime you see her, she generally declares war on you. My friend Rob and I used to have a joke that any map that included Godwinson included at least one war. Anyways. But if you look at all of the crises and the problems that happened back on Earth, it makes so much sense that it was a problem internally, that people didn't have the right mindset, that they were not spiritually pure, or mentally pure, or emotionally pure, and as a consequence, they lost their connection with what life should be. A positive, forward demonstration of what life can be, of good and righteousness and prosperity. And so, given all of that, she is adamantly determined to not allow that kind of degeneracy to continue going forward. Thus her fairly aggressive and hostile proselytizing. Which leads me, I suppose, to, let's just get this out of the way, Shengji Yang. Chairman Shengji Yang. I've kind of already talked about him, actually. He's probably the most hypocritical of all of them. So he runs a faction called the Human Hive. They're the Zerg Swarm. That's the simplest way to put it. They do best by having a large population, by having tons and tons of bases, and by having an overwhelmingly huge army. That's them. If you just want to swarm over the enemy, that's who you should play as. Now, what I do like about this is that the Human Hive actually works pretty well from a gameplay perspective. Because if you put them against someone who is either more advanced, like the University of Planet, or someone who is militarily superior, like the Spartans, who we'll talk about next, or the Believers, it's actually a fairly even fight. And I do like how they set that up to make it so that there's still a valid choice. I also tend to dislike Shengji Yang because he is a massive hypocrite. See, the thing about him is that he does firmly believe some of the ideas he posits, total control of the self. He actually mentions that, I will not take away your pain, I will teach you to learn how to manage and control your pain. Just stuff like that, right? He is absolutely in favor of that. But his faction is all in favor of the individual does not matter, only the state matters. And yet Yang himself, and this is actually true in basically all of the books as well, is someone who only cares about one person, himself. Now, all of them, as I mentioned earlier, are hypocrites to some extent or another, but Yang is the worst by far, because his personal ideology is in total contrast with his faction's ideology. In other words, if we were to say it honestly, what it should say is, none of you matter, only I matter. All lives are subservient in service of me. He is the true autocrat of the entire game. And that's one of the reasons why he can go burn in a fire. But again, I just mentioned her, so let's go ahead and talk about Colonel Corazon Santiago. Now, weirdly enough, despite the fact that she's usually portrayed as the military faction, I usually get along with her in most playthroughs. This particular playthrough I was going through for this one, I actually played as the last faction I'll be mentioning here, because I don't play as them that often. And the Peacekeepers, or excuse me, not the Spartans, and I managed to get along quite well. Even though they were like, military survivalists. See, their shtick is actually kind of funny, along with Corazon's own shtick. So, gameplay-wise, they are the ones who have the smallest, elitist army. In other words, they gain tons and tons of bonuses and benefits to morale, to leveling up, to offense, and to defense. So they can actually go through and with a single unit take on a much larger force because that unit is so much better. The thing is, though, like I said, that doesn't make them any necessarily superior to the Believers or the Human Hive. By the way, if you're paying attention, yes, that is 3 full factions that are militaristic factions of the base 7. Funnily enough, none of the new factions other than the aliens are militaristic. I find that interesting in its own right. Maybe they were trying to balance that out. But anyways, I digress. Point being, Colonel Santiago's ideology is the one I disagree with the most, I think. Her ideology is that survival is what matters. That's it. That's all. Now, anybody who knows me for any length of time knows that there's a quote that I borrowed from Voyager that I'm very fond of using. And that quote is, survival is insufficient. So for her perspective is almost in total violation to my own personal ideology on that survival is all that matters. That in other words, I talk so often about the difference between the tangible and the intangible, right? And how these two things form most of the basis of human existence, especially in fiction. Colonel Santiago is someone who really, really cares about the tangible. She doesn't care about ethics. She doesn't care about honor. She doesn't care about decency. You know what she cares about? Results. But she's not evil, again, and I do like that. Her and her faction are not evil, it's more that they are just very, very, very pragmatic. Which I suppose is a good time to talk about the person who is basically the total opposite of her. And that would be Lady Deidre Skye, my favorite voice actress by far of all the ones they picked for this. She has a wonderful Scottish accent, which goes along nicely with her. I'm pretty sure it's Scottish, please don't hate me if I'm wrong. It said she's from Scotland, I'm assuming it's Scottish. She leads the Gaia Stepdaughters. Now, she is one of the more unique factions, because if you're paying attention, most of the playstyles kind of fit in with Civ 2, you know, what was the 4X standard at the point. Because most 4X games really boil down to 3 basic concepts. Military, science, well actually, military, science, production, and war. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Military, science, production, and economy, excuse me. God, I'm tired. I may have played this game way too late last night. Anyways, it's a good game. What do you want from me? I wanted to play another one right after I finished. No time. Maybe I'll stream it someday. So most of these factions fit neatly into these. The Gaia's Stepdaughters are the first of the 2 original factions that don't neatly fit into any of those 4 spokes. Instead, they are environmental. Now, this is how the planet thing kind of ties in. So, environmental terrain problems aren't a new thing to a 4X game, but usually they boil down to 2 things. Barbarians, which have their own purpose, but basically are an early game problem and otherwise not, and actual terrain, like more difficult to move until you build a road, right? Here, though, the planet shoots out mind worms, mind artillery, mind hovering beetle things, and also mind serpent things. So, in other words, land, sea, and sky, as well as in terms of other functions, so bases, all have enemies and units which can go against you. And the further into the game you get, the worse they get. The more environment, so you have a stat, which is a whole new stat for this game, which is basically the amount of environmental damage you do. Now I know that's not new because in Civ 2 they had that, but in Civ 2 the only thing that mattered for was generating the waste thing, and that was it. Here it determines several other things as well, but it mostly determines how the planet reacts to you. The more waste byproduct you make, the more the planet is hostile to you. The less you make, the more beneficial they are. And if you are super planetary friendly, if you're super ecological, then you can actually build and use planet units yourself. Now that's a unique advantage. And this is a brilliant thing on behalf of the developers, because one of the biggest problems with barbarians is in almost every game, including modern games like Civ 5 and 6, Barbarians are an early game concept. They're there to either challenge you, level up your units, or provide bonus resources in the early game to jumpstart you or to challenge you, right? But by the time you're running around with people with shotguns or whatever, they are no longer a threat. They have stopped being a relevant factor. Mindworms never stop being relevant, even all the way into late game, because, like I said, there's multiple different levels of mindworms, and the mindworms themselves have multiple different types of approach and vector and attack, so there's no escape. There's no escape in the mindworms. And the mindworms use psychic damage, which is a unique thing that can still, like if you have a super mega tank of death, which has a very low morale and a very low psychic defense, one single mindworm will probably kill that tank because of the nature of how mindworms work. I've already talked about enough disgusting stuff today. I don't think you guys need to know about worms that burrow into people's brains while inducing them in psychic terror. So let's just move on from how horrifying those are. And let's just talk about their nature from a gameplay perspective. Because this keeps them relevant through the whole game. This then also makes the environmental stat relevant for the whole game. People who are severely anti-environment, like the University of Planet or the Morganites, for example, will have some very serious issues with these damn mindworms. Not so with Lady Deidre Skye. See, she starts out in her faction, the Gaia's stepdaughter, start out basically as a bit of a disadvantage, because they don't really have good tech or military or industry or anything. But they really have a lot of good planet. And that's basically a come-from-behind sort of a victory, if you know how to really slant it. It's key to try and avoid early conflicts, or to exploit early conflicts the moment you get your first usable mindworms. Also, as a quick aside, I'm astonished that controlling mindworms to attack other people is not something that's considered a war crime. Think about what these things do for a second. Anyways. So, Skye herself, again, I've kind of already said this, her ideology is that of environmentalism. That she believes that, basically, so she's kind of an interesting thing because she says the idea that we must all be, we must respect the planet, we must leave the planet untouched and pure and all that. But her actual mentality is closer to, we must coincide perfectly and evenly with the planet. I'm actually with that because I think that's a good mentality to have. In other words, it's a form of having control of your environment to coexist with your environment rather than exploiting it, damaging it, or ignoring it entirely. And so her entire ideology is, so many of the problems back on Earth could have been solved if people had just not wrecked the planet in the process of all the other things that they were doing. If there was some kind of regulation or code or whatever that made it so that people couldn't have destroyed the planet while going to war or while economically training things or whatever, then the planet wouldn't have gone to hell quite so quickly and humanity would have been saved. We wouldn't have had to leave the planet. So why not do the same thing here, but to the next extent, because now we have these mindworm things to deal with, so the planet is actively hostile. This leads me to the final faction. Now, this is the one I played as for this playthrough, because I almost never played them. Commissioner Proven Lal, who is, well, he's the hardest one to describe. Not in terms of story. In fact, by all accounts, Lal himself is the closest thing to the main character of the overall narrative, with, of course, Shang-Chi Yang being the main antagonist, not counting the aliens. Lal, he was someone who really believed in the UN Charter, who believed in the value and product of not just democracy, but the concept of democracy. In short, his ideology is actually fairly similar to my own. It's just he takes it to an extreme. The idea that even though we are different, we can still work together. There's a reason the ship was called the Unity, after all. But we don't all have to be exactly the same. We're not the Cybernetic Consciousness or the Human Hive. We don't all have to proselytize or bow and worship in exactly the same manner. We just all have to acknowledge that we are different and work together and respect each other despite that. That's his ideology. It's a fascinating one, a very ideological one, a very idealized one. And it also means that, in general, he tends to be the weakest faction. Because he has, as an AI, he will almost never go after you unless you are really doing some evil stuff. And he is extremely easy to work together with, so he'll be a good ally and friend for a lot of the game. But playing as him is interesting because he is the beginner faction. He is designed to be the beginner faction because most of the other factions I've been describing all are, extremely in one thing or another. Lots of offense, lots of industry, lots of economy, and severe negatives. Provenlal, the UN peacekeepers, they have basically no negatives. The only negative they have is bureaucratic inefficiency, which is a very minor negative. And then they don't really have any positives either. The only significant positive they have is one that works well with the new diplomacy feature, the fact that they gain increased weight and votes when it comes to any votes at the new UN. That's it. So this is why they are designed to be a newbie faction. So if you're playing this game for the first time, I would go ahead and recommend you either play as Zakharov or Provenlal, because they're designed to be the factions that you can kind of ease into the game before you want to try something more challenging and more difficult. I want to share one last thing with you. You can, if you just care about the game, you can stop now, because this is a personal thing. Anybody who's paid attention to me for a long time knows that I have my own little setting, which I refer to as the Imperium. And I've been writing that since forever, long before this game came out, several years before this game came out. But this game, in many ways, served as a jump starter for me in my writing career, or whatever you want to call that, because I found the very ideas and concepts of this game so fascinating that I just sort of naturally started sliding into the role of, as I was mentioning earlier, role-playing as my nation. This is something I hadn't really done in Civ 2 prior to now, or Master of Orion 2. But instead I found myself actually thinking, well, what would happen? Like, what is the story of this battle I'm having as I take over this base, right? What's the individual story there? So I actually started writing a story that was going to be an overarching arc throughout the course of this thing. The way it was designed was each chapter was told from the perspective of one of the different factions. And thus each chapter also happened like many, many turns after the previous one. So it's kind of a generational story, and we see the beginnings over here, and then finally the end of the story way over here. And I'm not trying to brag or anything. But what I do want to say instead, it was a lot of fun to work with this setting, because they had so much of a depth of world building and characterization that I really enjoyed it. And it's probably one of the reasons why this game has lasted so long in my memory. And admittedly, when I replayed it, it's still just as good a game as I thought it was. This is one of those games that definitely stands up even after turning on analysis mode. Thank you for listening to me yammer on about this wonderful game. I hope you've enjoyed. I'll see you next time, guys.